This is our July 2013 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. And this month we've got Ashley McGlone, who is a Microsoft Premier Field Engineer, who is also known as the Goatee PFE on Twitter. And he's going to be presenting this month on using PowerShell to reduce Active Directory token bloat. And he is the author of a chapter in the PowerShell Deep Dive book as well. And now I'll turn it over to Ashley.
Hey folks, how we doing tonight?
I'm doing well.
Doing good.
All right. I see Nicholas on there. How you doing, Nicholas?
Good, thanks.
All right. Well, this is a real treat to speak to y'all tonight. And you know, when I was on the Power Scripting podcast, I got a lot of ribbing over my Southern accent. So since I'm in the Mississippi group, I'm going to use my y'all frequently and get plenty of use out of it. So anyway, so my name's Ashley McGlone, Microsoft Premier Field Engineer, and just so you know what that means. Microsoft has a service called Premier, and by the way, I'm not in sales. I'll just tell you what it is. Premier service is for corporate customers that want to give Microsoft a chunk of change every year for some dedicated support. So I'm one of the delivery engineers that goes on site, and what I do is I help people with Active Directory and PowerShell. I teach workshops and do chalk talks and things like that. I do Active Directory risk assessments, and so that's what I do for Microsoft, and I've been doing that for 3.5 years. And I'll put up a quick slide with my contact information. So if you want to get in contact with me after the podcast here, or the meeting, you can reach me on Twitter or TechNet blog or Facebook or email. And typically I can respond to email within a couple days because I'm usually helping customers. And it takes me a couple days to get back to folks usually, but I'll do my best to get back to you with an answer. So, and also everything that I'm going to talk about tonight should already be out on my blog. So aka.ms/goatpfe. I won't make too many commercials tonight, but I just want to let you know that all the scripts, the modules, everything we'll talk about tonight is already published out there for you to download and play with. So, topic tonight is the PowerShell Deep Dive book, and my chapter is Chapter 8. It's already out on the preview, and this book's hopefully going to be out by the end of the week on ebook at least. And I was one of more than a couple dozen folks that jumped on the book project, and so my chapter is in the Part 1 under PowerShell Administration. And it's about using PowerShell to reduce Active Directory token bloat, and specifically focusing on the issue of Sid History. And I have to say that Sid History is not really an issue unless it's misused. You know, it's a feature actually, and so we're going to talk a little bit about how that feature can go astray when folks don't clean up after themselves when they do migrations. But anyway, that's the chapter, and if you got the Manning preview, you can go out there and go ahead and download it now. Otherwise, you can get the book here, hopefully within a week or two. You should be able to get to it. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And while we're at it, just to give you a specific URL that you can get to for the code that I'll be using tonight. The code that I'm going to be using is a module that I wrote a couple years ago, and I've been updating it ever since. I started it a couple years ago, but as you can see, I keep it current. So I just released an update today, version 1.5, and you can get that at aka.ms/Cid History. And that will give you a link to all of the blog articles in this series. There's about 8 or 9 articles now that kind of go through and talk about token bloat and Sid history and how we can resolve it with Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my PowerPoint at this juncture, and let's get into some PowerShell. Give me just a second here in show. There we go. All right. So as we get started, I'd like to know Who on the call works with Active Directory? So if you could just take yourself off mute and let's have a little bit of conversation here as we get started. How many on the call work with Active Directory?
This is Greg. I do.
This is Ron. I do.
This is Nick. I do.
This is Mike. I do as well.
This is Alan, and I do as well.
All right. Looks like pretty much everybody here is going to be using a directory, and that's because it's really a core technology. Everybody kind of has to know it. So for those of you that do use Active Directory, how many of you are familiar with the concept of Sid History as it relates to Active Directory migrations?
Absolutely.
All right.
Done a few.
Okay. Has anybody struggled with token bloat in your organization?
I have once.
Okay. What were the symptoms like?
Oh boy, we're going back a couple of years. Basically, they would not be able to sign in. We were having issues. It was like a 10,000 character limit tokens. Dealt with primarily their group membership, as I recall.
Right. Yep, that's spot on. So token bloat takes a number of characteristics that don't tell you it's token bloat typically. There's no big error message that pops up on a user's machine that says, hey, you have token bloat typically, unless it gets really bad. And most people never get to that point. So usually what happens is users will have trouble logging on, maybe group policy doesn't apply, maybe they have issues accessing resources, and specifically if they're trying to access like a SharePoint website where it's secure and they have to pass their credentials through the HTTP header, and that includes their Kerberos packet that has all their group memberships in it, their privileged access token, their privileged access certificate, the PAC. So all that gets encapsulated and it creates an HTTP request that's larger than the default window size for a web server, and that creates problems. So they can type their credentials all day long and it'll just keep bouncing back and asking them for their credentials. So those are some of the symptoms of companies that have token bloat. And the reason why I took up this cause was part of my job as a Microsoft field engineer is I go on site and help people get their Active Directory clean and help them audit and find what are the issues in their environment. And part of that is looking at token size. A buddy of mine, senior PFE named Matthew Reynolds out of Seattle, he wrote a token size test as part of what we call the ADRAP, the Active Directory Risk Assessment. And in that test, it goes through, does a good job of quantifying where token bloat has occurred in the environment, whether due to group nesting or group membership issues, which is one issue that causes token bloat. But the other issue that causes token bloat is Sid history. And essentially what happens is during an Active Directory migration, whether you're using the Quest migration tool or the Active Directory migration tool, most folks choose to use Sid history in that process to bridge access between the old and new domains. And that's what it's intended for. It's a feature, and we built it in for that reason. Unfortunately, a lot of people, though, when they get to the end of the project and they're running behind on their schedule and there's complications with removing Sid history maybe, or they just need to get things moving, they will leave the Sid history on the users and groups. And that, it's not a one-to-one ratio, but effectively it kind of doubles the size of the token, because now I've got Sid history for my user account, but I also got Sid history for all my group accounts as well. And then those groups are nested with nested SIDs and Sid history, and each one of those SIDs goes into my access token and creates token bloat. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch between group nesting and memberships and Sid history. So there are a lot of tools out there online already that work with cleaning up groups, but the reason I got into this was because I couldn't find a lot that would help people find and identify the SID history that was in their environment, where it came from, what service I needed to target to clean up, and so forth, so that I could remove SID history from my environment without any impact. And that's the ultimate goal, so that we can reduce the token bloat. The key phrase there being without impact, because if we just go in and remove SID history, we could orphan a bunch of ACLs. And I know everybody here is an IT professional, but just to define the terms to make sure everybody's on the same page. So an ACL is an access control list, and that goes on to a file share, goes on to the share itself, and then it goes on to the Ntfs permissions as well inside there. And then an ACE is what we call an access control entry inside that access control list. And inside those ACEs there are SIDs. And the first piece that we can look at here is some code. Let's see if I can open up my demo code here. Right here, get ACL sample code. So what I want to show you is that when we do a get ACL, it brings back a number of attributes or properties. And in here, in these properties, we'll get back to the top. So we've got the path. And by the way, something that's real important to understand about get ACL, when I give it a path of a share and it's the root of the share, it's not going to get the share permissions. It's getting the Ntfs permissions at that point. That's a key distinction to make. So what we're working with right now, we're looking at ACLs with Ntfs permissions specifically. Now, there are three properties that I like to point out here that all give us the same information, but in just a slightly different way. So down here in my output, there's this access to string, and that's all it is a string. Basically, it's a human readable report to show you which groups have permissions to this Ntfs resource. And all it's good for really is just for reading. Programmatically, you'd have to parse through this to really do anything with it, and that'd be more of a pain. So we're not going to use that. Next is the access property, which is a little more useful. It's actually a collection of file system access rules. So each one of these file system access rules is an ACE in the ACL, and if we explode that and dive in, we can actually get into the properties of each one of those ACEs. But when I was writing this code, I chose to do a kind of a little bit of a different approach. I wanted to use the SDDL string. And when I wrote this code, what I noticed was, first off, if you look at the access to string here, the domain for most of these says Coho Vineyard, and that's the main domain I'm in now, the new domain on the migration side of things. Here's an old Tailspin Toys account, and some of these, though, actually some of these Coho Vineyard accounts were migrated from Wingtip Toys using all the different Microsoft Play domain names. So Wingtip Toys has been migrated, but I can't see that in here because it's in the SID history and the proper SID name is being resolved. So the only way I can really find that is to go down into the SDDL. And when I look down on the SDDL, I find the actual SID strings that are involved. And when I look at those, I can look at the domain portion of the SID, and I can notice that this domain portion, the last dash, is the RID, which is the unique part that's unique to that account. Everything before that's the domain SID. And when I look down here, I can see that this little piece of this SID does not match this piece of this SID. That means I've got more than one domain involved in these. ACLs, as we can see above. And here's even a different one. So 3 different domains are actually in this in these ACEs, when the access string only shows me 2. So in order to really get under this, we have to look at the SDDL. So let's take another look at get ACL here, and we're going to look at the access property now that I was mentioning just a second ago. And here you can see, here's the identity reference, file system rights is inherited, all these things. But again, in the access property, it doesn't give us the true name for where this is coming from, Sid History. It gives us the alias domain that we're in currently. So that's our problem we're trying to solve, is trying to find where this is. So if we look at just the SDDL property here, we'll see this long, ugly string, and it takes you some time. If you've not worked with the SDDL before, you just have to go out to MSDN like we do for everything else, and through the documentation and find out what all these little things mean in here. And what happens is if we bust this out, we split it on the paren, it actually makes it a little more readable. So you can see that here's an allow, and we've got object inherit, container inherit, we've got the permissions that are granted, and we've got the account that they're granted to. And so in here, this gives us a clear list of the SIDs, of the accounts and groups that are involved. So this is a little bit of background into what we're dealing with here when we're doing security translation, because what happens in your migration is you've got a member server in the old domain. Let's say it's a file server, and it could have Windows shares or NAS shares that have permissions from that old domain, and we have to translate those when we bring them across to the new domain. Well, one gap in the Active Directory migration tool, the free tool from Microsoft, is that it cannot migrate NAS shares because a NAS share is not a Windows host. The way the ADMT works is it deploys an agent to a Windows server that does all the translation across files and printers and profiles and registry permissions and service accounts and all this, that does all that translation. But to a NAS box, it can't run that agent. So this is where my code comes in. It actually will do that for you for free. Otherwise, you can use paid third-party tools as well. And there's nothing wrong with those third-party tools for the most part. So what I've got then, I've got this command that we're going to look at here in just a second called convert Sid History Ntfs. And you give it a path. And then we're going to pass it a what-if switch. And that what-if switch says, don't change anything yet, but just show me down that share tree, go through all the folders underneath that file tree, and find every instance of Sid History. And then we're going to, we can either add new Sid right beside it, or we can just do a swap and replace that old Sid with the new Sid entirely. So that's kind of where we're headed. I want to take a quick pause here and make sure I haven't lost anybody yet. How are we doing so far? Everybody tracking with this?
The better question might be who's not tracking.
Yeah. Okay. Just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right. So what we're going to do then is we're going to look at some Sid History code, and this is a module that I wrote for Active Directory admins who have to work with this and clean it up. And like I said, I've run into customers, several customers, who have lots of Sid History in their environment, and they're kind of strapped down by this. They've got these token bloat issues, and they can deploy some temporary countermeasures. There's a max token size registry that you can push out to all your clients, and that's not a bad thing. You can do that pretty easily. You can adjust the window size on your HTTP headers for your web servers and different things to kind of get around it. But there are still some other things in the background lurking that can cause issues. So I want to get this cleaned up. And so I've worked with one customer. They had, I want to say they had 58 domains in their forest that had been migrated in from different affiliates and acquisitions. The CFO just like ate companies for breakfast, and they had he said they had one year like 13 acquisitions in a year. So these guys just lived in the ADMT. And I worked with another company that once we cranked out the data from their Sid history, we discovered that there were over 100 different old domains represented in their Sid history. And this was another kind of conglomerate company that did a lot of acquisitions, and so they had tons of Sid history from ages past. And some companies that I work with, the Sid history comes from when they originally migrated from NT4 to Windows 2000. And so you'll see lots of Sid history depending on the size of the company. Small or large, a lot of people have it. So that's kind of why I created this then, was to help people quantify it, identify, and see where it's been used. So in the book, basically I took some of the content from my blog and formatted it into a chapter. I had they wanted shorter chapters, so I had way too much content. So I had to kind of limit my content in the book to just 2 functions in this. And so I'll talk about those, but I'll talk about some other functions as well. So this is a PowerShell function, a module with advanced functions in it. And this module file is a PSM1 file. It has all my version updates there across the top and some little instructions for somebody trying to set it up for the first time. And so then in here we've got advanced functions, and you can see the typical advanced function syntax here with the comment-based help. So in this module there is a prolific amount of help. I want to make sure that it's very, very well documented. Okay, so I was talking about the documentation in this module. I went to great lengths to make sure that every function is documented really well. And I had a customer who actually printed all the blog posts in the series, printed all the help, all the code, and put it in a binder and used it for their project manual to work through their Sid history remediation. So it's pretty well documented. So I would encourage you to use the help here. So this is the first function that we're going to use, and it's called export Sid Mapping. And what this one does, it's really not that complicated. We're going to do a single Active Directory query with a get ADE object. I'm going to pass it an LDAP filter, just because I'm old school and I like LDAP filters, where Sid history equals star. That means any account that has Sid history on it, not just users, it can also be groups. And so we're going to look for anything that has Sid history on it, and then we're going to retrieve a specific list of attributes. And in that list of attributes, we want to make sure that we get the object Sid attribute, which is the current new Sid for the account, and then the Sid history attribute. But then there's a problem. The Sid history attribute is multi-valued because a user can be migrated more than once. So what we're going to have to do there is we're going to have to do an expand property and expand the Sid history attribute so that we get one row for each Sid history entry. And then what we'll do is we'll take that query and we're going to dump out 2 different reports. We're going to create one that labels the old Sid and new Sid so that they're easy to read, and then we're going to throw in a date timestamp in there in case we run it multiple times and aggregate it up into a database. That way we'll see which run we're working with. And it's going to dump that out to sidreport.csv. Then we're going to take another one and create what's called a Sid mapping file. And a Sid mapping file is literally just old Sid and new Sid side by side in a CSV file. And you can use that with the Active Directory migration tool or a number of other tools that allow you to do security translation. And what that essentially says is here's all the old account SIDs, here's all the new account SIDs, so when I go to translate ACLs on this file server, just remap them according to what's in this file, and you can give that to the ADMT. Now, the problem for a lot of customers is if they use the Active Directory migration tool in the past, that server is long gone. and they don't have the database still in place that has 100% of all the Sid history documented in the environment. That's usually what I find. And so in this case, we'll use the Sid history data that's already in AD to dynamically rebuild this mapping file, so you can install the ADMT and then just slip in the mapping file and use that to do your security translation, because the ADMT is still the preferred way to do your translation, because it does have a lot more than just ACLs that it does. So that's going to be the preferred way, but in some cases you may not need that. You may just need the ACLs, and so then we can use the scripts. Okay, so what we do then is we dump that out to a file. We have to peel out the quotes that it puts. When we export a CSV, we always put quotes in there in PowerShell, so we have to just peel those out because the ADMT doesn't like those quotes in there. So that creates a Sid mapping file, and this spreadsheet that we generate here off the first query is really what you're going to use to see where all the Sid history exists in your forest, because this will pull it back from multiple domains from the global catalog. It's going to show you all the Sid history across all your users and groups. And if that's all we did, that's really slick, because what you can do then is you can pull that into Excel and you can do pivot tables off of it. So you can pivot by the old domain, pivot by user or group, pivot by a number of attributes there to see different groupings that make the data much more meaningful for you. And so that's the first report that we'll get, just to know where the Sid history is on all of our accounts. So that's one half of the equation. We've got all the accounts with Sid history, and the other half of the equation is all the resources with Sid history. But before we get there, the one thing about this list, when you get the output here from this, let's see, where did I put my sample output? And that folder is empty. Let's see. I'm in the wrong folder. There we are. Let's see. Get down through my output here. And so this is cidreport.csv. When I open this, I know this might be smaller than the other text, but essentially I've got the object class over here, the old Sid and the new Sid, and the account name. In this case, it's a group called legal, and when that group was created, and then the distinguished name, the path to that object. So that goes in the report. So the thing that's missing here, though, is I've got a bunch of these old SIDs. And these old SIDs really don't mean anything to me. They're just a bunch of numbers. So really what I need to do is find out, well, if I look at the domain portion of that, how can I find where that account came from? Because if I've got, I've had customers with, 20,000, even some over 100,000 instances of Sid history in their environment, they want to know where that account came from to begin with. So what I did was I wrote another function in here, and I'm going to have to jump down the module file just a second here, and we're going to find the domain SIDs. And this function, export domain SIDs, what it does, to make a long story short, it crawls all of the trust objects in the forest to find all of the trusted domain information. So there are a number of different trust configurations, as you're aware. You can have a forest level trust, you can have a shortcut trust or an external type trust. You've got built-in automatic transitive trusts inside a forest with child domains. And so we want to enumerate all of these trusts to find all of the domains in the forest, and then for all those domains, any trust that they have outside of the forest, where there may be trusted affiliates or companies that have been acquired and merged in, And then across a forest trust, we want to enumerate not only just the root domain of that forest trust, we want to enumerate all the child domains under that remote forest trust. And obviously there could be other trusts beyond that, but a trust of a trust of a trust, we just can't reach that with permissions. So you can rerun this code in those other forests as well to kind of grab the trusts from those perspectives and then put them all in one file. But what this does is this function actually is going to go, it uses a combination of WMI and .NET, and we're going to use the forest object here. This is like get AD forest, except we're actually going to call the get current forest, and then we're going to come down here. We're going to let's see if I can find the exact line that does the magic. And what we're going to do is we're going to enumerate all trusts in the forest. Right here, get all trust relationships. So that's a really cool trick. NL test is a command line utility for the net logon service, and it can do this. And this is the actual API that it calls. So that gives me a slick, quick way to get all the trust relationships. And then I go through every one of those trusted domains, and I try to enumerate the trusts from those domains as well. And at the end of the day, we end up with a hash table here that we dump out with domain and SID. And what that looks like here is the domain SID's CSV. And let me change the font size up on this a little bit so you can see it. And what this file looks like then is it's got a list of all the domain names and all the domain SIDs all across the forest and all the trusts. So now you can see we got two CSV files. One has a bunch of old SIDs, and then this has the domain SID portion defined to a string. So the next logical step then would be to update that mapping file we generated earlier to translate and add a column that shows that old SID actually corresponds to, let's say, wingtiptoys.local, because we can see that it ends with that domain SID portion right there. Okay, so we got a function down here called update SID mapping. Update SID mapping function. It's going to go through and open those files then. It's going to open up the CSV report, and it's going to give us a new SID report updated, and it's going to open up the domain SID's CSV. And it basically just goes through and extrapolates from the old SID. It isolates just the domain SID portion, puts that into a column, and then does that for the domain SID of the old and new SIDs both. And then it looks up in the hash table here. Actually, it's creating a lookup value from that CSV, and then it does a lookup to populate the old domain name and the new domain name here. And what happens then is when we go back to look at that report, the SID report updated, we have several new columns, and I'll make this a little bigger. And so now in that report, instead of just having the numeric SIDs, we actually have the old domain name and the new domain name. Now in my lab with just a couple to play with, that doesn't look very fancy. But when you're a production environment with 50 domains involved and 70 different Sid history domains, this all of a sudden becomes very important data, because now I can take this in Excel and I can do pivot tables that show me by old domain how many user accounts and how many group accounts are showing up with Sid history from that old environment. So I want to pause right there and just take a pulse and make sure that everybody's still with me. I'm not boring anybody. This is all highly relevant, and you're finding some good information here. So is this something that looks handy for you guys? Okay, getting good feedback in the chat room, so We'll keep going. All right, everybody's enjoying it. Good thing. So this data then all of a sudden becomes a gold mine of information showing me that what I've got in Sid history across all my accounts. And that's the part where the chapter in the book leaves off, because that's about all that I had time to explain in the book chapter. So then what we do, let me come back here and actually do a little bit of code. So I'm going to import the module Sid History, and I'm not going to go through the steps to install the module, because most of you folks on here already know how to do that. If not, you can read through the blog series. It tells you how to install the module, and you can also look at the help topic about_modules to look at how to install a module. So you can download it from the TechNet script gallery in the links that I provided earlier, and I'll provide those links again at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to import the Sid History module. You'll notice that when it imports, it also imports the Active Directory module automatically for you. So the next logical thing I want to do here is get command to see what commandlets or functions I got in that module. So I'm going to look at the Sid History module, and here's a list of all the functions that are available. And I've just recently expanded this with a blog post I put up today, and I've posted a new version that's got some new functions in here. The main one, the ones that we were just looking at, we looked at export Sid mapping, we looked at export domain SIDs, and then we looked at update Sid mapping. So those are the first three that you're going to run, and you don't even need parameters for those. If you're just working in a single domain or single forest and from one administrative workstation, obviously you need to have the AD module installed from the RSAT. It could be a Windows 7, 8, or 2008 R2 or above with the RSAT installed. So you just need that AD module as a prerequisite. And then once we've got this mapping file, like I said earlier, we got two sides of the coin. We got the users with Sid History, and then we got the resources with Sid History. Well, here's the idea then, is that once I've got this data in this output file that says, hey, the old wingtiptoys.local domain is where the majority of these counts came from, what servers did we migrate then back during that migration? So that's a real trick in some companies, right? Sometimes the person that did the migration is long gone. Maybe there's no documentation for that project, or perhaps you're the person that did the migration a long time ago and you just forgot all the details. You know, maybe you don't have this documentation because of legal retention reasons. You had to purge your documentation. Who knows? But what you want to do then is go see if you can find a list of servers in your environment that were involved during that migration. And I want to make a note here that some companies, and it's a great thing to do, if you take your old Windows file servers and you migrate them all to a NAS, when you do that migration, a lot of times people don't do ACL translation. If they're doing an Active Directory migration at the same time as a NAS migration, they may not do an ACL migration. They might just take all those Windows file servers, move all the data and ACLs in place straight over to the NAS without doing ACL translation. In that case, yeah, the server's no longer around, but those old ACLs are still there on the NAS. And so you got to be aware of that. That's one potential. Another way that this can happen is if you simply rejoin the file server to the new domain, instead of running the migration tool against the server where it enumerates all the ACLs and fixes them all, instead of doing that, you just go into the properties of the server and you say, hey, I'm going to change the domain name and rejoin the new domain. And when you do that, it orphans the profile, number one, but more importantly, all the ACEs and ACLs on that box have not been translated by the tool. And so that means you've got potentially Sid history in file shares, printer shares, registry path permissions, decom permissions, you name it, all kinds of places where those permissions can hide. So anyway, what this tool focuses on is just the file system ACLs, because that's usually where the majority of the work is. So what we want to do then is we want to go back into our migration, if we can find some documentation to say which servers or NAS boxes need to be rescanned to make sure that we don't have any Sid history out there, because now you can see we've got Sid history as the bridge between the new domain and the old resources. And if I go into that new domain and just delete all the Sid history attributes to clean up my token size problem, that could be a resume generating event. Because now, all of a sudden, I've orphaned all those users from their resources. Now, if the migration was done correctly, you might dodge a bullet and be okay, but that's a big bullet to dodge, and we don't want to do that. So we want to make sure that everything's clean. So the next logical step then is I need to go find these old SIDs hiding on my file servers. So to do that, there are two functions in the module. There's one called Export Sid History Share. And what that one does is it will enumerate the shares on a Windows server. It has to be a Windows server. It cannot be a NAS share because it uses WMI to get the share data. So if it's a Windows server share, it can enumerate the Sid history that exists at the share level. Now, at the time I wrote this, it was prior to PowerShell 3. So in PowerShell 2, all we had was WMI to work with. We didn't have the new SMB share module yet. So one of the updates I plan in the future is to rewrite this to use the new SMB share module and have it be able to rewrite those share permissions. Because right now it only reads the share permissions, but in most places that I've worked with, they said that's not a big deal because they just set everyone full control and they use Ntfs to manage the permissions down in the share. So it's not been a large enough feature request yet to warrant the effort to write that piece. So down the road I'm going to write something that will convert share permissions, but for now it just reports share permissions with Sid history. The one you're really going to use, though, is this first one on the list, Convert Sid History Ntfs. So what it does is you give it a path, and this migration file, this mapping file that we created, and it will go find all the old SIDs and all the ACEs through that entire file tree. And it'll dump them out into a big spreadsheet and show you where those old SIDs for users or in groups are still in use on those servers. And I've got some sample code here to show you what that would look like. And let's pop up the script window. Whoops. So I'm going to go ahead over here and import my module. And we've already kind of done these other steps here. So I can do my export Sid history share against this member server here. Whoops, got to grab the whole line. So I'm going to dump out. You'll notice you get a progress bar. That's always fun to do in PowerShell. I love those things. And then I'm going to do a Sid history Ntfs dump here. And I'm just going to tell it with the what if switch. We're not actually going to translate into the ACLs yet. What we're going to do is we're just going to say, if I were to translate ACLs on this server, please scan the file tree and show me where those old SIDs are hiding. So I'm going to run that, and we get the nice little report. And here it gives us a list that I've got a share Sid history report, and then I've got the Ntfs Cid history report, but then I also have an error log, and I also have a Sid translation report and a text file, which is more of a verbose log. So let's go look at these files, and let's see what it found. So here is my share Sid history report, and in this CSV file, I know it's a little bit small, I've got server name, start path, and the folder. I got old SID, old domain SID, new domain SID, both telling me if both the old and new SID entries are present. So if I've done an add here where I've got both the old SIDs and the new SIDs simultaneously using this function, it'll show me whether I've got both SIDs in place right now. And the Acl type, whether it's a file share or a printer share or an Ntfs Acl, it shows me the Acl type, then the operation being an add or replace, and the date timestamp that I ran it. So over here in the data, you can see that this is a share file Acl type, and it's got all the SID data in there. And then if I look at my, let's see right here, this Ntfs Cid Report. Again, this is just a small test share, so not a lot to work with here, but in production you'll find a lot more. So here I've got the start path where I was on the share 1, and then the actual full path to where the SID history was identified, what SIDs were found there. And then in this case it's an Ntfs style permission, and we were doing the default replace operation with a what if. So it's false saying that it's only the old SID, not the old SID and the new SID present. So the thing that is cool about these files then is the columns all match. I did that on purpose, obviously. So what you can do then, and I'm not going to demo this piece, but you can take, let's say you run this across 10 or 20 servers, and now you've got a bunch of CSV output. There's a function in the module called merge CSV, and you can take this function merge CSV, drop all the files into one folder, and you pass it a name that you want to give it, and it'll take all those CSV files of your output and wrap them into a single CSV file. Then what you can do is you can pull that into Excel and do pivot tables off of it. You can pull it into an Access proof of concept database. You can bring it up into SQL. Combined with your SID data from all the user objects, now you've got all the old SID data against all your file resources. So we've got these two CSV files just begging to be related, and so you relate them on that old SID column in both files, either with Access or SQL, and then you can create really rich reports that says on servers 1, 2, and 3, I've got old domains A, B, and C, and then on servers 4, 5, and 6, there's just domain B, and it's got 4,000 users that have been, or groups that have been assigned permissions on those servers. So this gives you some really amazing forensic data to go find and hunt down SID history where it's in use on your file servers. So I'm going to take another pulse check right there, open up for some time for questions, Q&A as we go along here. Okay. Would have been nice on a few of my past migrations. Yeah, sorry about that, Alan. Yep, this has been out for a couple of years now, and I get emails all the time from people saying, "Oh man, I wish I had seen this earlier." But a lot of people also send me emails and say, "Oh man, this saved me weeks on my project." So hopefully, if you guys need this in the future, it'll be there for you. So some of the other things that we can do then is I just added a -add switch in the current release, which I mentioned earlier, and that basically says, in this case the what if doesn't matter, but go through and add the new SIDs beside the old SIDs in the midst of a migration project so that I don't have to go back and clean everything up right away, because if I clean everything off right away, sometimes when you're trying to do a department at a time, that's not very friendly. So what this allows us to do is to do an add first off on that share path, and then come back later and run it without the add switch, and it'll do a replace and remove all the old SIDs. Oh, but I need to show you one thing I forgot to mention here, the error output log that I created now. This is kind of important. Because when you're scanning a large production file share, you're going to run into some issues. It's not going to be clean. You're going to have permission denied errors. So you've got somewhere down the file tree that admins were removed from the permissions, and this error file will log the path. In this case, the folder is called access denied. It'll log the path where that occurred, so you know that, hey, I didn't get a complete scan and I need to go fix this path before I continue. Another problem here is a read error for long paths. There's a path too long exception. Man, this is a headache, let me tell you. We thought, you would like to think that in 2013 we are past the 260 character limitation, but we're not. And when whether it's get child item or get ACL, a lot of these commandlets that take paths, they're limited to 260 characters on the path. And believe me, I have researched this hours and hours, and there's no easy way around it. So, and the other downside is that PowerShell v2 will not bubble this error. You have to have PowerShell v3 to see this error actually get thrown. And so you want to make sure you're running this from a v3 box if at all possible. So I've got this really long path here underneath the share, really long path, and it keeps going and going and going. And so it's telling me that, hey, I've exceeded the 260 character path length limitation. The other one that you'll run into is wildcard pattern exception. Like, what in the world is that? Well, it's not really a file access issue. The problem is that if I've got a bad path with a left bracket, a left square bracket, the PowerShell parser actually interprets that as like an index, an array index type thing, or a wildcard, like with your square brackets, different types of expressions that could use square brackets. So what happens is it doesn't even make it into the getACL call. It actually ends up throwing an error with the parser because it sees this square bracket. Now, the good news is this one is fixed in PowerShell v3. There's a literal path parameter. Instead of using getACL-path, you can use -literal path, and it will ignore this. So right now I've not updated the code to use all the v3 features because I wanted to keep some legacy compatibility in. So on the next release I'm going to update it so that it doesn't. But for now, this will be flagged. And where I found this is in some deep paths with folders and documents where maybe somebody saves a web page as a file, and it might drop those square brackets at the end with a 1, 2, 3, or different things. Different cases where some file naming conventions will use square brackets, that throws it off. So now you've got a log file to go in and show you what paths need to be addressed when your scan did not complete successfully. So that's in the error log output. Let's see. So we've gone through the shares. I've got some sample code that when you download the module, here's some example code from v2 that shows you how to get a list of shares from a server. And then if you wanted to take a list of servers from a text file and then grab all the shares and then pass all those share names into a convert Sid history with a what if, you can use that as a way to go through and enumerate through a massive number of servers and shares. The only catch there is that they do need to be Windows file servers. The alternative, though, is that you can create a text file with share paths if you have NAS shares, and just create those NAS share paths in a text file and pass those in a loop to convert Sid history in Ntfs and give it that share path, and you can do batches of large file servers that way, because a lot of times we're talking about terabytes of data and it takes overnight or days to get this data. So it takes a while. Now I also have a new function in the module that I just released, and it's called Search Sid History Acl. And what it does is essentially it takes these for each loop wrappers to look at share and Ntfs permissions and throws them into background jobs so that you can spin up as many as you want, obviously within the limitations of your hardware. There's no throttling built in, but you could spin up 40 different share scans all at once and it'll get a list of servers from an OU, or you can give it a list of share paths from a text file, and it'll just spin them all up in background jobs. And then I created a little job management function called watch job that gives you a progress bar to show you how far you are through the progress of doing all those scans. Because when you're sitting there looking at this for hours, it's kind of nice to know where you are in the process. All right. So so far so good. Any questions at this point? Okay, everybody's good. So let's roll on down here. So here's an example of search history ACL. Given an organizational unit, it'll just go crawl all the servers and look at all their shares, and then go dump all that out into CSV files with your data. Here's an example using a share file and using the credential switch so it passes in credentials to that file share path. So now let's fast forward through the process. So I found all the users with Sid History. I found all the resources with Sid History. I've gone out and I've run the conversion to re-ACL all those resources. I get down to the very end of the project, and I'm now ready to remove Sid History. This is where you want to step lightly and do it in small batches, obviously in a production environment. You can test it in your test environment. As usual, the IT department's usually the guinea pigs. Go through their shares first. And so what you want to do is start to pull off Sid History from accounts, being mindful that the only way to get it back, to restore Sid History to that user account, the only way to do that would be with an authoritative restore. The alternative is if you remove the Sid History from the user and you start getting calls to the help desk, then it might just be an isolated pocket of users where one particular group or share was impacted, and you can just go manually add the new groups and resolve it that way. You don't always have to fall back to a restore of the Sid History. Sometimes it's just small enough impact that you can clean it up manually in the new production environment with the new groups, and you'll be fine. So the way we're going to remove that, then, there's a script out on TechNet. If you search the web for how to remove Sid History, you'll find a little script out on TechNet that basically says, select all accounts with Sid History and remove it all. And if you do that, you're going to be looking for another job. So don't do that. But what we're going to do here is we're going to use get Sid History. This is a little command or a function that I wrote. It basically it's a structured get AD object query from PowerShell, but it's going to pass in a number of different parameters. So if I pass in a group name, show me all the people in the group called legal that have Sid History. And here it is. It gives me their DN, their distinguished name, and their SID of that account. Show me everybody that has the domain name, the old domain name, tailspintoys.local in their Sid History. Now this is really clever because what it's doing is it's taking that domain SID file we created earlier, and it's going through all the Sid History to find anybody that has that old domain SID portion for tailspintoys.local. And when I run this, it's going to show me here are all the users from that old domain that are still around in the forest. So I can use this as an audit checkpoint, and I can then pipe these into remove Sid History, which is a commandlet or a function that I wrote in the module to actually then remove it. But let's be more strategic than that. Let's say I've got one particular user account here, BJ, and I see that BJ has two different Sid History instances on his account, and I only want to remove one of those. So what I can do is I can vary with a laser focus to say, give me the Sid History on BJ's account, only Sid History that came from Tailspin Toys, and then it'll give me just that one Sid History entry. I could combine these parameters to find only people in the legal group that had domains at Tailspin Toys. And what this allows me to do is to surgically target where the Sid history is on which accounts by account name, groups, domains, and so forth. And then all I have to do is take the output from that commandlet, and this remove Sid history commandlet uses parameter binding so that you can just pipe this distinguished name and old Sid straight into remove Sid history, and it will remove that Sid history then permanently from the account. And that's how we get to the end where we actually clean it up. So that's the overall process that this uses to remove the Sid history. But I ran into a really curious scenario with a customer who they had manually created a bunch of domain local groups in a new domain, and they had the exact same name as the old domain, but they'd not migrated those accounts. So essentially what I had in that case was two sets of groups in two different domains with the same name but no Sid history, and I needed to do a migration for them. So I said, well, what we can do then is we will enumerate these accounts from both domains, grab the SIDs off of them, and throw those into a Sid mapping file. So without having Sid history in place, we can create our own dynamic Sid mapping file to do Acl translation without needing to install, going through all the hoops to install the migration tools and all the prerequisites. Had another customer who had an international affiliate, and they were not allowed to create a trust with that affiliate, but they needed to migrate their users. Well, obviously you need a trust to that affiliate in order to get to them. So what they did, using this function, was they were able to export in this isolated environment. It could be somebody on the other side of the world, a DMZ, wherever. And what they did was they took, they ran just a basic export using getAdUser or getAdObject, and it exported the account names and SIDs and some key information. And then we took that CSV file of data that was emailed or FTP'd from that other site, and then we matched that CSV snapshot of data against the production environment data where the accounts had already been duplicated, using a key attribute that's unique. It would be like employee ID or SAM account name, and we faked the Sid history mapping file so that without installing the tools, migrating accounts from a disconnected environment, all they were going to do was take the file server out of that old environment and just leave everything else and just pull only that file server over to the new environment. So they were able to do that without a true migration taking place. And if you think a few steps ahead, you could even use this for doing Acl migrations. So let's say you're doing a big group restructuring where you're regrouping all your permissions and everything. So you could, outside of the context of Sid history and migrations in Active Directory, you could use this same tool to do migrations of just any type of Acl translation. And the name of that function is export Sid mapping custom. And what you can do is you can combine any combination of live domain controllers in the old and new environment or CSV output files of the old and new environment. And as long as that CSV file is a dump of the attribute names with like SAM account name and object SID and say employee ID or whatever you want to match, you can use that as input to create a dynamic no migration Sid mapping file that you can then use to do Acl translation. So does that sound handy to anybody? All right, lots of affirmation there. So here's an example. All right, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to do a getAdUser for just the users that begin with A to limit it to a small set. I'm going to grab the object SID and the SAM account name from the Wingtip Toys DC, and then I'm going to pipe those into a CSV file and call it wingtip users. I'm going to do the same thing for Coho Vineyard users. And so then I can take this data and create a dynamic mapping file from both of these CSV outports. So I can take a look at these files that I've created. And you see I've just basically got a list of SIDs and usernames in each one of these environments. And then they don't have to match in number either. I've got 59 in one and 32 in the other, so it'll just find the ones that actually match up in the environments and that match on name. So what I'm going to do then is export a custom SID mapping file, and it's going to be for user object types. And I'm going to match it on the SAM account name. And I've got an old CSV file from the old environment and a new CSV file from the new environment. And I'm going to give it a map file name here, WTCV map. And then I can combine this in any other scenario with the CSV file or the live domain controller to pull those old server, new CSV, you know, whatever kind of combination, old server, new server, it can be live. And then I can do that to create this custom mapping file. And then at that point, it's just a matter of using the map file with our translation tools, whether it's the ADMT or one of the Acl type executable utilities or something else that you script in. You've used the convert Sid History Ntfs function here to do that without needing a migration really in place. It'll do that. And it looks like we're running short on time here. I want to make sure I get in. One last thing is get domain SID word count. This is really fun. So a lot of the customers that I visit have old trust in place in their environment, and maybe they're from migrations that happened 10 years ago, but nobody ever bothered to go remove those stale trusts. Now, it doesn't bother me that they're still there, because that means that the domain SID is still associated with the old domain name, and I can query that and build my map file so I know where those old domain SIDs go to. However, like in this last customer I mentioned with 100 different old domains in their SID history, they didn't have 100 old trusts still around in the environment. So we had to figure out a way, you really don't have to know it, but it sure makes things easier to know where those old domains really came from. And so what we did was I wrote a function for them that would create what I called a domain SID word count. And what this does, we can jump down in the module file here, the domain SID word count. Let's find it. Only 1,700 lines. I'm sure it's towards the bottom. Here we go. So what it does, let's get into the query here. All right. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to select, that doesn't look right. Main SID word count. Okay, yeah. So we're going to grab all the data out of our Cid Report updated file, because it's got all the data we need. And then what we're going to do, in that file, we already have the display name, the distinguished name of the object. And so this is kind of clever. What we do is we go through and we say, all right, if all the accounts migrated from that domain came from, let's say, the Contoso partner. Well, probably, most likely, that affiliate name is going to appear either in the display name or the description of the account, or maybe it's in an OU called affiliate partner name or whatever. So what we do then is we take for all of these accounts with the same old domain SID, and we have no idea where they all came from, we create basically a word counter that says look at every word that appears in the display name, the description, and each piece segment of the OU path. So each OU in the tree that they belong to take each one of those names, and then we're going to count how many occurrences of each word occur across that whole domain, the old domain Sid. And then when we look at that data, it's going to give us a clue of where those accounts came from. So if I run this and pipe it to an out grid view here, now in this case, it doesn't help much because I've got a small environment. I've just got an OU called migrated where I stuck all the accounts. But what you can see is that I've got this old domain Sid that ends as 77 in a migrated OU. I've got 73 instances. And then I've got 66 accounts that have the word migrated appear for this one. So imagine that that's like a company name. You see I've got 7 Davids, 5 Kens, 5 Peters, and so forth, because those are just common strings that occurred in there. So what this does is a clever way to help us identify those old domains and where the accounts came from. So then what I can do is manually go in and edit that domain Sid CSV file and just copy the old domain Sid and paste it in here and use the comma separated and put some kind of a name string that means something to me for that old environment, and then rerun that update Sid mapping file, and it'll show me then for all the other domain Sids that I couldn't find with trusts. So it helps me find all that data. Especially looking at large migrations, this stuff starts to come in very handy. So that's the Active Directory PowerShell module for Sid History. And there are a few other nifty little features in there that we don't have time to cover, but I'll let you discover those on your own. Most of them are documented in the blog series. And I'll throw up that slide again here. Let me put that up. So if you go out to aka.ms/go/tpfe, or you can go to aka.ms/Sid History, and that is a shortcut to all of the blog posts in the series. And put a little plug out here for Microsoft Services. So if you'd like some help working through this, obviously I can't come camp out at your site, at your company, and help you for 3 months with your project. But what I can do is I can come in for 3 or 4 days, help you get the module up and going if you'd like help with that, and help you kind of get through your first few scans and get through the process and give you a documented process on how to do this moving forward to clean up your environment and for future migrations to make sure that it stays clean. So I'll offer that as well. If you're a Microsoft Premier customer, you can invite me to your company and I'll be glad to come help you with that. Okay, so it looks like we are running down towards the end of the meeting here, and it looks like Link has dropped off my IM session, so I apologize. I can't see the IM session, but anybody would like to chime in, come off mute, and let's talk through this. I'd like to hear about some of your migration stories and anything that you think that this could help you with, or any possibilities you see with this. Let's talk about it.
Okay, does anybody have any questions at this point?
I'm good. Thank you for the presentation. It was excellent information.
Sure.
Yeah, this was a really good presentation. I want to thank you for presenting for us this month. And as Ashley said, he wrote a chapter in the PowerShell Deep Dive book, and it's currently still in the Manning Early Access program, but it's within the next few weeks it's supposed to be available as, you know, not a pre-release, but if you do buy the pre-release, of course you get the book when it is released. And all proceeds for the book go to charity, so nobody's getting paid for their time they spent writing their chapter, and the publisher and everybody. It's all for charity.
Yep, it's a good thing. And there are some fantastic articles in here. I think everybody would like a copy of this.